Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's all totally free with no catch. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to spotify.com/podcasters to get started. Join me in collaboration with Wolf Hall Weekend next June at Cat Hay House in Devon. Book now to experience the literary event of the year in celebration of Dame Hilary Mantel's multi-award-winning Wolf Hall trilogy. Join a weekend of personal tributes, expert talks, celebrity readings, interactive workshops, literary and historical reviews, and good food in the enchanting period location of Cat Hay House in East Devon, a favorite location of Hilary's close to her home. This is a unique and immersive event where many of Hilary's friends and colleagues will honor her memory and share their experiences in helping to bring her literary genius to the world through books, stage, and screen. Historical experts will shed additional light on the turbulent world of Thomas Cromwell, and literary experts will explore Hilary's imaginary interpretation of Cromwell that works its magic on her readers. This is a limited capacity event, so make sure you book early to secure a place. You'll find a link in the show notes.
Welcome to another episode of Tudors Dynasty. My name is Lacey Bonar Hull, and I'll be your host for today's episode, where I interview author Kathleen B. Jones on her upcoming book, Cities of Women, her debut novel of historical fiction that explores the lives of women, both modern and medieval, who dare to challenge social norms. Born and educated in New York, Kathleen B. Jones taught feminist theory and interdisciplinary writing for 23 years at San Diego State University. Besides several scholarly books, she published 2 memoirs, Living Between Danger and Love and the prize-winning Diving for Pearls, A Thinking Journey with Hannah Arendt. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in Fiction International, Mr. Beller's Neighborhood, The Briarcliff Review, Brevity, Humanities Magazine, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Among her numerous awards, she is a recipient of multiple grants from the National Endowment of the Humanities, writers' grants to the Vermont Studio Center, a Distinguished Alumni Award from CUNY Graduate Center, and an honorary doctorate from Örebro University, Sweden. She holds an MFA in fiction from Fairfield University and lives in Stonington, Connecticut. Cities of Women is her debut novel. Join me while I chat with Kathleen about all things Christine de Pizan and medieval manuscript culture.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Okay, so I am joined by Kathleen B. Jones, the author of the upcoming novel, Cities of Women. Hi, Kathy. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Lacey?
Oh, I'm good. I am so excited to be talking about the book. I just have absolutely fallen in love with your characters and your writing style, and I just cannot wait to share with the listeners a little bit about your novel. So I have a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So first of all, just the subject matter of the book. How did you come to land on this subject matter? So what made you want to tell this particular story?
That's a great question. I have been fascinated with Christine de Pizan for decades. I first came across her when I was expected to teach a course which at the time was called Women and Western Civilization at my university, San Diego State. And I read the Book of the City of Ladies and a number of other of her publications and was just fascinated by her voice and her biography, which I read little tidbits about, and thought, gee, that would make a great novel. But I was also obsessed with the medieval manuscripts at the center of her life. And the fact that they're such extraordinarily sensual objects, they're visual, they're tactile, and the production process that went into them had long been of interest to me as well. I could see examples in the museums in New York where I grew up. And when I started out to think about telling this story of a woman in the late Middle Ages who becomes a prominent writer and the basically producer of her works, collaborating with other artists, scribes, and so forth, I thought that would be amazing, but I can't really focus on her. It's better to bring in a secondary character to tell Christine de Pizan's story and the story of the manuscripts through somebody else who would have been connected to her work. And then I thought, well, I don't want to get caught up in the falling into the pitfall of writing about history without making it relevant to now. And so the idea of what's called a dual timeline novel came to me, and that brought forth the contemporary timeline of an academic who's sort of dissatisfied with where she is in her career and just sets off on a new path to try to prove that the artist who illuminated the manuscripts of Christine de Pizan was another woman named Anastasia. And behind all of this was the idea that the past is never really past, that it leaks into the present, that time is more like a continuum that we can float in and out of different periods. And I think the experience that Verity, the modern character, has of with the manuscripts is as much about how that time of the past still leaks into the present and can become a kind of obsession, which it does for her.
You're speaking my language, Kathy. As someone who deals heavily in medieval manuscripts, and like you're saying, the physicality of the manuscripts, that really spoke to me in your book, because so much of the book does revolve around the production of these manuscripts, which I just absolutely loved reading about that process. So can you tell us just a bit about how medieval manuscripts were made and the role that manuscript creation plays within your novel?
Okay, sure. Well, it was first and foremost a collaborative process. I know when you think about a workshop and people talk about the workshop of Christine de Pizan, one imagines somebody in a room or a large room where other people are all around and the scribe's corner is over there and the parchment maker is in maybe in the back outside. But in fact, the way it worked was that each of these artists or artisans had their own atelier or studio in medieval France. And France, Paris, was really the center of the book trade at this point in time. And so ringed around the center of the city, the Ile de la Cité, and on either side of the Seine, the right and the left bank, were these artists' studios. And an author would come to a bookseller with an idea, and the libraire or the bookseller would have a group of people he or she was familiar with: the parchment maker, the scribe, the illuminator, and the bookbinder, and might recommend to the client who had a commission, say, from some noble person for a book of prayers or something, various artisans. And they would then take the vellum that had been prepared, the parchment that had been prepared by the parchment maker, in quires, in folded sets of leaves, to a set of scribes. And that was fascinating to me. It wasn't the case that a book was necessarily produced all by one person copying it. And what was also fascinating to me was that the scribes would write in the leaves of the book the words that the author wanted there, or the prayers that were to be included, and leave spaces for the illuminations, whether around the borders that were called foliated borders, where there would be all these elaborate, flowers and mystical creatures crawling out of the page, and also squares where there might be particular images that would be set in to have a conversation with the text. The other thing that I found fascinating about this, about the medieval manuscripts, was that they're almost like the precursors to our modern graphic novels. There's a conversation going on between the images, the visuals, and the written word. And you see this extraordinarily in Christine's books, where she might have an image of herself presenting the book to a queen or a duke, and she sort of situates herself as the author in these manuscripts. After the folios were inscribed and they were taken to the illuminator, the bookbinder's work came into play. And sometimes one thinks of the bookbinding, no, not very consequential, but it's what held the whole thing together and allowed the work of these various authors to survive for centuries. So that isn't necessarily a lesser trade, even though it hasn't gotten all of the artistic flourishes that you see in the illuminations themselves. So that's just a little sort of a nutshell of how the production process took place, where some sets of materials would be gathered from different places, different studios in medieval Paris, and then all of these artisans' work would come together in this collaborative process of bookmaking.
And you do a really fantastic job of really bringing that to life in your book. I mean, even discussing like the quality that you could find in different sheets of vellum at the time. I really love that, because when you are, holding these manuscripts, you can tell even, 600, 700 years later, just the different quality in vellum from the manuscripts that would have been produced for like the Duke and the Queen that you're talking about, versus the manuscripts that are produced more for like daily use, for something like maybe like a doctor, like a medical professional who also manuscripts with them, and they still, would have been these high quality materials, but just like a different feel in the vellum. And I think you do a really good job of describing that. You've also really captured the essence of what it's like to be a medievalist. There were so many times throughout the novel that I was just like blown away by how you gave words for like the experience that you can sometimes have in an archive, having that aha moment and feeling really deeply connected to the people who worked on these manuscripts, who owned these manuscripts, who used these manuscripts. So what to you is so special about the Queen's book, this Harley MS 4431 that's housed at the British Library? And have you had the chance to actually see, or I like to say meet, this manuscript in person?
Well, let me answer the second question first. Unfortunately, no. I tried when I went to the British Library to come up with a compelling reason why I could see Harley 4431, which is known as the Queen's book, because it is a compilation of so many of Christine de Pizan's writings that she assembled with the support of Queen Isabeau, who was the regent at the time to Charles VI in France. And it was with her support and in also to underscore the Queen's ability to be regent at the time when Charles VI was in one of his madness bouts, shall we say. And so it's a very important manuscript. And precisely because of that, and it's traveled through many, many, many hands to finally arrive at the British Library, it's one of their most precious books. And I couldn't get permission to actually see it in person. The entirety of the manuscript is, as you know, digitized. So you can see in great detail every single page of the what's now 2 volumes. It was originally one huge book, and it was divided into 2 over the course of time. I did my best, and I had letters of support from different people, but I'm not a paleographer, which is to say, I'm not somebody who studies the nature of the script or the paper itself in such detail, or even, needs to get that close to the texture of the paint and the decorations to be able to say something about that aspect of the manuscript. So no, I couldn't. And it was disappointing. But at the same time, it led me, the disappointment, to be able to write scenes where Verity, who's confronted with that same fact, she's not able to actually see the manuscript that she's obsessed with, that it allowed me to write about the emotional experience that she's having in relation to these objects, and to express her both disappointment and renewed drive, to figure out this mystery that's at the heart of her investigation. Was Anastasia responsible for any of these paintings? And as an aside, the only knowledge we have about Anastasia comes from the book of the City of Ladies, where Christine de Pizan mentions her name. We don't know whether she's real. She could be entirely fictional, representative of what Christine's saying about women's contributions. But that was great for me because I could invent her character precisely because we don't know anything about her, and basically make up the story behind Anastasia. The story of Beatrice, who is the young girl growing up in a really difficult time in medieval France, who becomes the artist Anastasia in my novel. It's fiction. There's basis in a lot of facts, but not that one. We don't know whether she ever even really existed. But for a novelist, that's great. It lets your imagination go wild.
Yeah, that's sort of like the dream. You start with one little nugget of a person who I would think likely did exist, or I would like to think that, especially after reading your novel. But you do a really fascinating job of positioning this possible woman in her historical context, and explaining how these women probably would have come to join that occupation, and certainly giving voice to, I think, a group of workers whose story has largely been lost to history, to the point where you hear reference to these masters,
Right.
because it is just assumed that this was a largely or entirely male dominated occupation, when in reality that likely wasn't the case. But it's like you're arguing from a lack of sources, when you're trying to give voice to those types of experiences. Can you, and this kind of leads into my next question. So I can tell that you have poured a lot of time into the research that you put into this book to give that really engaging and accurate historical context. So can you tell us a little bit about the writing and research process, and maybe share your favorite topic that you researched when you were doing that background digging for the novel?
Sure. The research process was exciting for me, and that is partly because my background in academia. It's both the bane of the scholar's existence, and therefore it can be a burden to the novelist. But the process itself was incredible, and I was lucky to be in touch with a number of medieval scholars who had done extremely expansive research on the manuscript production process, and was very, very helpful. And it gave me the confidence to create this woman character, Anastasia, because in those conversations I had, largely through email, I did come across people who could verify that there were women in all of these trades. And, I wasn't making it up entirely. So we know there were women scribes. Not only that, we know there were women illuminators and parchment makers and all of those trades. And one person in particular put me onto this extraordinary resource that's available through what's called geographic information systems. They've actually mapped medieval Paris onto the records of what are extant records of medieval Paris onto the contemporary Parisian maps. So I could trace where illuminators would have lived and practiced. And that was just, I would go back to those maps all the time to make sure I had that level of accuracy about, which side of the Seine were the illuminators on, the painters, which side were the parchment makers on, and so forth. And it was as if I were like traveling back in time, walking on those streets almost. So that was one factor. The other that was really amazing for me was we don't know very much about Christine de Pizan's youth. So there I had a lot of license, and I did research into the Italian background from which she came, both her father's work in Bologna and later the family's residence in Venice, because she was born in Italy. And one of the most fascinating things I researched and that excited me, but that never made it into the novel, was finding out in Venice about prostitution in Venice, and that many of the prostitution, let's say, houses, okay, were run by women because the leaders of the city had found so much corruption and exploitation of the women when men were running them. And I wanted to create a character, and did. I wrote several chapters, but this is what happens when you write a novel. Is it really necessary to the story, even though you fall in love with what your research has told you about this period of time? No, it wasn't. And so those chapters and all of that went out the window. And that's really an important thing that anybody who's writing a novel set in the past has to learn a lesson about: the balance between, research and fiction. And, that you can't put everything in. It has to be necessary to the character's development or to the plot or whatever aspects of the story you're telling. So working with those maps of medieval Paris, working in the archives in the British Library, I had experience working in the archives in the Bibliothèque Nationale from some other work that I had done in my past. So just like you're saying, archival research and the aha moment, it never stops having a kind of lure for me. And actually also the connection between what's in the novel, between the medieval manuscripts and those pre-Raphaelite artists, William Morris, and all the people in his circle, was another thing that was just amazing to me to have learned about and to be able to talk about in the novel.
I love that. I love that it seemed like it really blurred the boundaries of chronological time for me. So we were already following along with these two medieval women and their experience.
Yes.
And then we're also following along with a modern woman who is discovering another fascination with the Middle Ages through the pre-Raphaelites too. So I
Right.
love it. I just felt like there were so many layers. And it sounds like that's what you're talking about too, with being able to map these medieval locations on a modern map of Paris. And then when you're in Paris and actually walking in the footsteps of these manuscript makers, you can, I think just get a feel, especially there's something about Paris and especially the river area of Paris where it seems like you're just, having some sort of a historic reaction, it feels like time is very much different in Paris, I guess is how I would put it. And I felt like you really bring that to life, to where I had just told my partner yesterday that we need to get back to Paris because now I want to experience it, having this, kind of in the back of my mind. And if you do decide that you're going to write another novel on that other thread of research, let me know.
I will.
Sign me up. So I have one more question for you. I know your time is a little limited. You're busy, so I don't want to take up too much time. But I really fell in love with your characters. So would you be able, just maybe in, a quick minute or two, give just your favorite aspect of each of the three main characters that
Mhm.
you developed for this novel?
Sure, sure. Verity, who is the modern professor, what excited me about her is her ability to be bowled over by beauty. Just that, often we think of academics as living in their heads all the time, and that's true a lot of the time, but she's driven by something else. There's a line in the novel where she's having a conversation with her friend Regina early in the novel, and she says, "Well, look, I wanted to be a dancer." There's this art dimension, the creativity, and that is important in her character. That and the idea that she becomes obsessed. I'm fascinated with her obsession with what drives her, what keeps her going, even though she's continually confronting obstacles to any of what she's looking for ever being found, all the way to the end. So Verity, that character, the other modern character who's also called Anastasia, and not accidentally. Names of characters are very important in a novel. The modern Anastasia, what I love about her is that she seems to be a really crusty, kind of sarcastic, ironic language sort of character, but she's got a soft core. And the relationship that develops between the two women, between Verity and the modern Anastasia, reveals ultimately her vulnerability, her insecurity, and beyond that crusty exterior, there is something too that they come together and actually, wind up falling in love around their shared passion that cuts through, what we often present as our faces. And then the medieval character, Beatrice, who changes her name for reasons that you'll have to discover when you read the story, she's just so feisty. I mean, determined. She loses her family except for her mother in the plague, which is a horrible experience that of course we all moderns can relate to. But she's just so determined and clever and wily, and she's got goods and bads about her. She's not pure, let's put it that way. And I like that. I like that about a character who's, she shouldn't be perfect. None of the characters are perfect, and that's what makes them interesting, I think. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I think so too. You can tell each character has layers to them. You might think that what you get to see, at the surface level is all that goes into a character. And then as the novel develops, it's interesting because you feel like you really get to know these women who you're writing about, and you realize, how complicated, especially with the modern women. I think it's interesting to be able to get that sort of an insight into this relationship between the two of them, and how their work really helps to inform that relationship.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I love that. I just felt like there were so many layers to the novel that it really kept you engaged the entire time. I love the time flip element of it too. So thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming on and talking about this book. So the book is released in September. You can pre-order now, and I would highly encourage anyone who has an interest in this time period, or this type of a story, to check out Cities of Women. It is a fantastic novel by Kathleen B. Jones, and thank you so much, Kathy, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Lacey. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Kathleen B. Jones. Her book, Cities of Women, will be published September 5th, 2023 by Keylight Books, and is available now for pre-order.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.